Welcome to the first episode of Woke Mental Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Cassie. Thank you for checking out the podcast. Woke Mental Wellness is a show, blog, and community devoted to Black queer mental wellness and the issues that impact us. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, and then we're going to talk about some of the basics of what the queer community is. So, a little bit about me. Like I said, my name's Cassie. I'm a recent Master's of Social Work graduate, and I've been in the field of mental health since 2014. I have my Certified Recovery Support Specialist certificate. I identify as asexual, queer. My gender is complicated. My pronouns are she, her, pending some review. And my diagnosis is bipolar and PTSD. So I have, as you can tell, a lot going on and a lot of intersectionality, which we're going to keep talking about. So now that you know a bit about me, let's talk about what I mean when I say queer. Queer is a lot of things, but primarily whenever I'm saying Black queer, I'm talking using it as an umbrella term to mean people who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus spectrum or umbrella. So that was a lot of letters. And for those that might be new to them or might be new to some of them, I'm going to go through and just give you a little bit about what each letter means, maybe a little history and some definitions. So the most well-known part of the queer community is the G and the L, the gay and lesbian people. That's people who are attracted to people of the same sex or gender. We've heard a lot about the gay communities and lesbian communities, especially with the marriage equality movements in recent years. B is bisexual. That's people who identify as being sexually attracted to people of both same or different gender. Another word that doesn't have its own letter right now, but is similar to bisexual is pansexual, which is the term for people that are attracted to any gender. Their sexual attraction is not defined by gender typically. Bi and pansexual have gotten a lot of discussion in recent years about which is the proper one, people saying bi means two. And that's not necessarily true anymore. So just to note, some people might use bisexual, some people might use pansexual. You're going to see some amount of difference between generations, which is a theme that you're going to notice as we talk about the letters. But both are completely valid and people can identify as they want. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the T, which is trans people. That's going to be people whose gender is different than the gender that they were assigned at birth. So with trans, that's now also an umbrella term, and you'll notice I'm saying trans and not necessarily transgender or transsexual. Transsexual specifically is a term that in recent years has really fallen out of favor. So when we talk about the trans umbrella or trans as an umbrella term, that's going to include people that identify as non-binary or NB, people who identify as genderqueer, gender fluid, people who identify as agender or androgynous are sometimes also listed under the trans umbrella, but are also sometimes not. That's still something that's being discussed and up in the air. So the Q serves a double purpose. It's both queer and questioning. So the Q is much more of a catch-all. It's going to be people who will use queer just to say, I'm a lot of things and no one word really describes me properly. So it's queer. It's this or that. It can describe gender. It can describe sexuality. It can describe a combination of both. And then on the questioning side, that's for people that are exploring their sexuality or their gender and are thinking that they might be part of the community, but maybe don't know where they fit. Maybe it's not the right time for them. Lots of different things can be a factor when we talk about questioning side of that Q. I is for intersex. Intersex people are people who were born with the sex characteristics of multiple or both sexes, depending on who you talk to and whether or not they ascribe to a binary definition of sex or not. I happen to be one of those people that there are multiple sexes, not just either or. So I say multiple. But when we say sex characteristics, that can be body parts, genitalia, internal organs that scientists have decided are emblematic of either male or female. And if we start talking about chromosomes, then that gets really complicated, and we're not going to go there today. That's going to be a different episode. A is for asexual. This is my sexual orientation, also known as ace. Ace people don't experience sexual attraction. When we're talking about sexual attraction, that's that, ooh, I want to bang that person kind of feeling that people get sometimes. That's something that ace people don't experience. Asexuality is also a spectrum, and so you'll hear people say things like gray A or demisexual. They're also part of the community, and similar to pansexual, don't have their own letter. When we're talking about A, there's some people that will say that A is for ally. This is incorrect. The acronym LGBTQIA+ is the acronym for what have been considered gender and sexual minorities. Therefore, including ally, 1, it erases ace people, and 2, there's not really a reason to include the dominant condition or the dominant class in an acronym that's supposed to be giving visibility to minorities. So allies are not included in the acronym. We adore our allies and we really need you guys, but your place is not in our acronym. So then we have this plus at the end. The plus is in recognition that gender and sexuality are ever-evolving, nebulous, socially constructed ideas that change and that we don't know everything about. We're finding new things all the time, whether it's the animal kingdom, whether it's humanity. Gender and sexuality are complex and ever-changing, and so that plus is there to say, hey, we know not everyone's letter is in here, but it would get really long and really complicated to add, subtract, etc. So we're going to put a plus here to know that even though your letter's not here, we still see you and you're still welcome here. So going back a little bit and talking a little bit more about the word queer and what that word means now and why, as I say that word over and over again, some people might be cringing a bit, particularly those who are a bit older. I'm a millennial, and so while I know what queer used to be, it's also a term that I came into the queer community hearing not as a derogatory. It did used to be a slur. It was a word that was used to other people, to shame people, to delegitimize people's personhood. And when we use the word queer to refer to ourselves and to refer to the community, we need to know that that's our history. We need to know that queer isn't just academics. It's not just something where academics came together and was like, oh, queer theory, the way you hear it a lot now. Queer isn't just Judith Butler. Queer is something that you could be murdered for, you could be thrown in jail for. It's something that was hurled at people to hurt them in recent memory. It's a word that we have worked to reclaim and that a lot of people do use as part of their identity. as a protest and as something to say, I know that's what you used to use it for, but now this is a part of me. Yes, you may find this strange, but I'm proud. But also there's going to be some people who are going to hear that word and it's going to take them back to a really bad time. Possibly could be triggering. So if somebody in the community, particularly a community elder, asks you not to use that word or asks you why you're referring to yourself that way, please make sure that you respect them and that you allow yourself to step into that role of being able to explain yourself, because not everyone is going to have a positive association with that word. Now that we know what I'm talking about when I say the queer community and when we say LGBTQIA+, let's talk about this piece about intersectionality. Let's talk about the Black piece specifically for this podcast. Intersectionality as a theory is something that was founded and developed and introduced by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who was a Black female professor and really started introducing this idea that when we're talking about identity, we're not talking about just one thing. We're not just talking about being Black. We're not just talking about being ace or just being trans or genderqueer or aromantic. We're talking about things that come together to not only make up a person, but also come together to make up situations and make up the way people are treated and what's happening. So part of this is when we start talking about communities of color. This podcast is focusing on Black people because that's what I am and that's what I know. But a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are also going to be somewhat generalizable to communities of color in general, specifically queer communities of color in general, because this piece of intersectionality of identities, pieces of identities coming together is true of everyone. And so when we take two marginalized identities and we put them into one person or three or however, then we get things like compounding oppression or secondary or tertiary marginalization, which are these ideas that basically say, if you're a member of one marginalized group and then you're a member of two or three, then you may also be marginalized in those groups as well. So when we talk about, say, a white cis, which is cis is the word we use for people who identify as the same gender they were assigned at birth, as opposed to trans, someone who was assigned one gender at birth and identifies as a different one. When we look at somebody who's white, gay, cis, and wealthy, that person, they're gay, but they also have a lot of privilege going on. When we then talk about somebody like myself, for instance, who's Black, I'm frequently perceived as a woman, and I identify as queer and asexual, and I grew up and continue to be somewhat broke. Then we start seeing compounding effects of Black people have higher likelihoods of being poorer. They face discrimination based on their race, might have less access to a good education and things like that. And then you also take a category of someone being part of the queer community who might be discriminated against based on their gender or their sexuality, and you put those together, then you have a person who's kind of getting it from multiple sides. You've got someone whose racial identity and racial group might shun them or shame them for their sexual or gender identity, where people who are of the same gender or sexual identity might not be as accepting of their racial or ethnic identity. And so you get this back and forth secondary, tertiary discrimination and oppression, and these things that theorists like Judith Butler and people talk about with things like the charmed circle, which you can look up and find out more about. That would be a different episode, so I won't go too much deeper into the theory portion, but I think you're starting to hopefully understand what I'm talking about when I'm saying kind of compounding oppression and intersectionality. So what does all of this mean for our mental wellness? What does this mean for how our brains function, how resilient we are, how we get through things, and how we get support or don't get support? Well, people who are queer and Black have higher rates of suicidality than their white counterparts and their Black counterparts. This can be particularly true of youth, where when we talk about suicidality and when we talk about mental wellness, familial acceptance by the family is one of the biggest tells of risk for a queer youth. And that's whether you're Black, white, whatever. If you're queer and your family accepts you, that lowers your risk. So it is incredibly important that as a community, as a Black community, we are accepting of our queer people, because when we're not, that's just adding to the burden. When we talk about being Black, particularly in America, there's so much trauma, whether it's microaggressions, things like people saying, "Oh my God, you're so well spoken," or "Can I touch your hair? How does it do that? You're so smart for a Black person. You're pretty for a Black girl." Those little needling points that add up and really start to build and develop in the back of your mind, those microaggressions, they cause a little bit of little t trauma as we go through life, and they can build if we don't have outlets. Now that trauma, when we think about seeing unarmed men, women, and children getting shot by police on the internet day after day, that is also incredibly traumatic. And then when you add being Black and trans, for instance, trans women have some of the highest rates for murder, being murdered, of any group, and they frequently go unsolved. Trans women, Black trans women, frequently are the victims of violence, rape, assault, murder, and that is people who try and use things like trans panic, which is where somebody finds out that the person they're with is trans, and then they harm that person and try to claim that they panicked or they felt threatened or they freaked out as a defense for why they hurt another human being. And cops do this too. So when we talk about intersectional identities and we talk about our Black trans women, our Black trans femmes, and we think about, okay, someone hurt you, then get help, call the police. But then what if the police are the people that hurt you? Like, you're already Black, you already might mistrust police based on the, 26th video you've seen this week of someone being shot. But then the police are transphobic too. The police are sometimes homophobic. Sometimes so are teachers. And unfortunately, sometimes so is the health system, mental and physical. And that amount of weight just in the air constantly, even if something hasn't happened, can really affect the mental wellness of Black queer people, it can increase rates of depression. And recent research has shown that particularly young Black boys show depression in ways that are not defined in what we're taught in our programs, whether you're like me and you're a social worker or you went to school for counseling. The way that the DSM has defined depression and depression symptomology, the way the tests are built, they do not reflect us. They do not reflect the way depression manifests in Black people frequently. And so that's another way that intersectionality is affecting our mental wellness and is affecting our ability to get help, find support, whether it's friends, whether it's professional support, whether it's education, whether it's housing. Queer youth, once again, and especially queer youth of color, have some of the, if not the highest rates of homelessness amongst youth in this country, because families will throw them out for trying to live their lives and be themselves. So when we talk about intersectional identities, therapists frequently aren't trained how to deal with and how to be compassionate and deal with racial trauma, of which Black people are, by some reports, the biggest victims of in the United States. We suffer some of the most racial trauma of anyone else. And this is not to play trauma Olympics. This is just to note that our intersectional identities are affecting us. It affects how our brains are working. It affects our wellness and the kind of support and self-care that we may need and may find helpful. And as this blog and podcast and community move forward, these are going to be things that we're going to revisit time and time again. Housing, homelessness, trauma, depression, suicidality, all things that when we look at intersectionality, we're vibrant and we're beautiful people, but we also have some unique struggles about us that we need our allies and our providers to know and understand and be taught about, so that we're not having such a hard time finding good providers, and so that providers aren't having such a hard time becoming good providers, because we're not taught these things, and it's completely up to us as mental wellness or mental health, whatever label you prefer, providers, to educate ourselves to be the best for our clients, whether they're queer, whether they're of color, or whether they're any other intersections or any combination of intersections. That can all sound really dire and kind of depressing if we're honest, but there are things we can do, and there is a lot of hope. So I don't want anybody to get me wrong on that. So what do we do? What do we as Black queer people do to try and find services or help or support or community if we want it? Well, we can create it. We live in an incredible age of being able to do things like the internet and Facebook and meetup.com on Tumblr and Twitter and all of these other fantastic ways to network. They have their bad sides too, and they definitely have their impacts on our mental wellness themselves, but they also provide a great opportunity for people growing up, whether it's in the city, but just you don't know if there's anybody in your neighborhood that's going to accept you, to growing up in the middle of bumfuck nowhere and not knowing where to find other people. The internet is an incredible place. It is where you have found me. And it's where we can continue to find each other. We can do things like Skype and GChat and all sorts of things to meet each other if we can't meet up physically, or we can plan physical meetups and we can make community. We can find each other and find community. That's how some of these identities that are seen as newer or emerging, like asexuality, that's really how they gained sight. That's how they got seen and viewed, is the internet. For the asexual community, it was Avon. And we can continue to do that. As Black queer people, there's all sorts of places. So then, what about as providers? What do we do? What do we do to be better as a field, as individual providers, and as members of our respective communities? We educate ourselves the same way that Black folk have been telling white people to educate yourself. Don't put it on the people or the identity or whatever that you're trying to figure out how to do certain things, how to approach it. Like, there's information. Learn how to discern what quality information is and start educating yourself. Encourage your workplaces and your colleagues to educate themselves, to update their policies. As this podcast and as this blog continues, posts and videos about pronouns and navigating health systems and education are all topics that hopefully we're going to cover either directly or as part of another topic, and are all things that as providers, as professionals, even if you're not a mental health provider or mental wellness provider, we all need to do better at, to make people feel welcome, to make sure people have a place to go if they need or want help or support. Teachers, this means you. Lay people, people working anywhere. There are queer people everywhere. There are Black people everywhere. There are Black queer people everywhere, and there are people of every color and every identity all over the place. And we have to do better as humans of treating each other better and understanding better, not assuming that the gender you perceive someone as is the gender that they ascribe to. Just because someone has long hair and a dress and maybe boobs, maybe not boobs, does not mean they use she, her pronouns. Teaching ourselves to default to gender neutral until we get a chance to ask. It's a small thing that we can all do to make people feel welcome and to lessen the microaggressions and the little t traumas that people have to go through that can really increase depression and anxiety and other mental wellness concerns. We can petition our lawmakers to stop this nonsense that they are doing right now of trying to revoke people's rights because they don't understand yet. We can stand with humans who just want to live their lives. We can say no to being afraid of things we don't understand. There's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot that no matter what your position is, you can do for yourself, for your friends, for your family, for anybody. Because we are all in this together, and that's something that also hopefully is going to be a theme here, is that no matter what, we're a community and we can do something about this. We can make ourselves well. We can have some happiness and a place in this world that isn't on the struggle bus. Nobody should have to live on the struggle bus all the time. And we can build that community and we can build that world, and it's going to be piece by piece. But there's something we can all do. And this podcast is my way of hopefully doing my part. That that brings us to the end of today's episode and the end of our first episode of Woke Mental Wellness. Thank you for sticking with me, and I hope that you'll come back and listen to future episodes and engage in our emerging community. You can find me on YouTube, Patreon, Facebook, and Twitter. All of those are Woke Mental Wellness, and you can email me if you have any questions or you would like to suggest something and don't feel comfortable or maybe don't have Facebook or Twitter, because I agree they're a little evil. You can email me at wokementalwellness, all one word, at gmail.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening to Woke Mental Wellness, a Black queer mental wellness podcast for us, by us, and about us.